Bullies tore the new teacher's shirt at roll call. Minutes later, they were begging for forgiveness. It was her first day. Her very first day as a real teacher. Miss Layla stood at the front of the classroom, a little nervous but mostly hopeful. She had dreamed of this moment ever since she was a little girl, pretending to teach her stuffed animals. With her lesson plans carefully color-coded in a binder and her modest green blouse ironed neatly, she walked into room 7B with a soft smile and a spark in her eyes. But what she didn't know, what no one had warned her about, was that 7B wasn't just any classroom. It was the school's war zone. The students, most of them 15 or 16, were notorious across the school, not for their academics, but for their defiance, disrespect, and ruthlessness. The last teacher lasted only 3 days. Before that, one left during lunch break and never came back. It was a well-known secret no one could handle them. And now, standing there with trembling fingers gripping the roll call clipboard, Miss Layla was about to discover why. It started with whispers, then laughter, then louder whispers that weren't whispers at all. One student crumpled a paper and threw it at her back when she turned to write her name on the board. Another one mimicked her voice in an exaggerated, mocking tone. But she pressed on, pretending not to notice, trying to stay calm. "Good morning, everyone," she said, her voice soft but hopeful. "My name is Miss Layla, and I'm very excited to be your English teacher." A scoff echoed from the back row. "Oh, we're thrilled, Miss Layla," said Jamal, a tall, popular student with a permanent smirk and a small group of boys always hanging around him. "So tell us, what's your plan? Gonna make us write poems about our feelings?" The class roared with laughter. Miss Layla paused. Her heart beat a little faster, but she didn't break. "Actually," she said gently, "we'll be writing something more powerful. Stories about truth. Stories about you." That seemed to confuse them, but it didn't disarm them. As she walked between the desks, handing out a short exercise sheet, one of the boys stretched out his leg, tripping her just enough that her papers scattered. They laughed again. She bent down to pick them up, forcing herself to smile. She wasn't going to cry. Not here. Not in front of them. But then it happened. As she stood back up, someone, no one would admit who, grabbed the back of her blouse and yanked it hard. The fabric tore with an awful sound, and her shoulders were suddenly exposed. The class went silent for half a beat, and then burst into cruel, echoing laughter. Miss Layla stood frozen. Her hands gripped the torn shirt, trying to pull it closed. Her cheeks burned, not just from embarrassment, but from something deeper. Shame, humiliation, shock. But she didn't run, she didn't scream, she just looked at them. Her eyes, glassy with unshed tears, scanned each of their faces. Not with anger, not with fury, but with something they didn't expect, something they didn't know how to handle. Compassion. She quietly walked out of the room, head held high, and didn't return for 10 minutes. When she came back, she had changed into a school hoodie she borrowed from the nurse's office. The principal had already been informed. There would be suspensions, detentions, letters home. But Miss Layla didn't speak of punishment. Instead, she returned to the front of the class and did something that no one expected. She sat down on the edge of her desk and began to speak. "I wasn't always a teacher," she said softly. "When I was your age, I was homeless for a year. My mother was sick. My father left. I used to sleep in shelters, go to school with the same clothes every day. People made fun of me. Teachers ignored me. And I promised myself that if I ever got out of that situation, I'd become the kind of teacher I never had. The kind who saw the broken pieces, not just the behavior." The room was silent. "I see pain in this room," she continued, her voice steady. "I see boys pretending to be strong because they're scared someone will see their weakness. I see girls who hide their tears behind makeup and sarcasm. And I see kids who've been told their whole life that they'll never be more than a statistic. But I don't believe that. I believe you have stories to tell, real stories. And if you're brave enough, we'll tell them together." Jamal shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He glanced at his friends, but no one smiled anymore. No one laughed. Something in Miss Layla's voice had cracked their armor. For the first time, they weren't facing a teacher who fought back with control or fear. They were facing someone who understood what it felt like to be invisible, to be hurt, to be lost, and who still chose to come back. A few moments later, a girl named Zoe raised her hand. "Can I go to the bathroom and get you a safety pin for your shirt?" she asked quietly. Miss Layla smiled. One by one, the students began to lower their walls. That day, they didn't do any worksheets. Instead, she asked them to write one paragraph. Who are you when no one's looking? The responses were nothing short of raw. Jamal wrote about how his father had been arrested last year, and how he felt like he had to act tough for his little brother. Zoe wrote about her struggles with anxiety, and how laughter was the only thing that helped her feel normal. Others wrote about abuse, addiction, hunger, and the constant ache of feeling unworthy. The next day, 4 of the boys, including Jamal, stood at her door before the bell rang. They didn't look smug anymore. They looked nervous. He stepped forward and said, "We're sorry, Miss Layla. For the shirt. For everything. We were wrong. You didn't deserve that." She looked at them, eyes kind but firm. "I forgive you," she said. "But I expect you to do better. Not just to me, but to everyone who walks through this world carrying invisible wounds." From that day on, the atmosphere in 7B began to shift. It wasn't perfect, but something real had changed. They weren't just students and she wasn't just a teacher. They were broken people learning how to heal together. They began writing more, sharing more, listening more, and Miss Layla, she kept showing up every single day, because sometimes the strongest revolution doesn't come with shouting or power, but with grace, with understanding, with choosing not to give up, even when you're torn down. By the end of the year, 7B wasn't known as the war zone anymore. It was known as the healing room. A place where stories mattered. Where people were more than their worst behavior. Where forgiveness wasn't weakness. It was the beginning of transformation. So if you're out there, feeling defeated or unwanted, remember this: you never know whose life your kindness might change. Sometimes, the ones who break you are the ones most desperate to be rebuilt themselves. Miss Layla stood at the door of the classroom with a fragile kind of bravery, her knuckles white around the clipboard clutched in her hands. The echoes of laughter from the hall had barely faded when she stepped into 7B, the room that teachers avoided, the room that held the reputation of swallowing hope and spitting out frustration. Her soft footsteps were nearly drowned by the muttering voices and smirking glances waiting inside. It was her first day as a full-time teacher, and everything in her life had led to this moment. Her shoes were not expensive, her bag worn from years of night school and substitute jobs, and her clothes were plain but neatly pressed. She believed in children. She believed in second chances. But what she walked into that morning wasn't just a classroom. It was a battleground of broken homes, angry hearts, and prideful masks. She greeted them gently, her voice soft but steady, introducing herself with calm sincerity. The class didn't answer. Instead, they exchanged knowing glances. Jamal leaned back in his chair, spinning a pencil between his fingers, already sizing her up like the others before her. Zoe popped her gum loudly, while Marcus scribbled nonsense across his desk. Miss Layla began roll call. That was when the first paper ball hit her in the back. She didn't flinch. She just smiled a little tighter, crossed another name on the list, and kept going. The second paper missed, but the laughter didn't. Still, she pressed on. There was a quiet strength to her that puzzled them. She wasn't yelling, and she wasn't pleading. It was almost like she saw right through them. As she turned her back to write the objective on the board, another student threw a pen that bounced off her shoulder. Then, in one sudden cruel moment, a hand from the back reached out as she walked past and yanked her shirt. The fabric tore loudly, violently. Her shoulders were exposed. Her dignity threatened to crumble right there on the tile floor. A stunned silence filled the room, followed by an explosion of laughter. She froze. Her hands instinctively gripped the edges of her shirt, clutching it to her chest. Her heart pounded in her ears, her face flushed with humiliation, but she didn't cry, she didn't scream. Instead, she looked up, straight into their faces. With a calm so unsettling it silenced even Jamal. She didn't say a word. She walked out of the room not in defeat, but in silent power. The hallway swallowed her as the students stared at each other, uncertain now. Something about the way she had looked at them, like she wasn't angry, just hurt, pierced their bravado. 10 long minutes passed. Some laughed again, nervously this time. Some looked down at their desks. Jamal, for the first time, wasn't smirking. When the door opened again, Miss Layla had changed into a school hoodie, slightly oversized but covering the tear. Her hair was still neat, her eyes red but dry. The principal had already been called. She knew consequences would follow. But when she stood before them again, she didn't speak of punishment. She didn't even mention the shirt. She sat down on the edge of her desk, took a deep breath, and began to talk. Not like a teacher, not like a victim, but like a human being. She told them her story, not for pity, but for connection. She spoke of sleeping on shelter floors, of the nights she studied by streetlight, of the humiliation she carried in every step of her journey. She told them she knew what cruelty felt like. And yet, here she was. Not to lecture them, not to control them, but to teach them how to rise. Her words were gentle, but they hit harder than any punishment. She looked at Jamal as she said, "Sometimes the loudest voices are hiding the deepest pain." She glanced at Zoe and added, "Sometimes we mock others because we're terrified of being seen." And finally, she opened her arms to them all. "You don't have to stay this way. You are more than your behavior. But you have to choose who you want to become." Silence swallowed the room. Then, slowly, something began to shift. Zoe raised her hand to ask if she could help fix her shirt. Marcus muttered an apology, and Jamal, usually the ringleader, stood up awkwardly and said the words no one expected to hear. "We're sorry. We were wrong." He didn't even look at his friends for backup. He just said it. From that moment on, the classroom began to change. Miss Layla asked them to write about themselves. Not essays, not grammar drills, but real stories. "Tell me," she said, "who are you when no one is watching?" What followed over the next few weeks was nothing short of a miracle. They wrote about fears, family, failures, and hope. They wrote things they had never said out loud. They laughed less cruelly, listened more carefully. They learned what it meant to apologize and what it meant to forgive. Miss Layla never brought up the torn shirt again. She didn't need to. Her response had taught them more than any punishment ever could. And in return, they gave her their trust. Bit by bit, the classroom that once destroyed teachers became a place of quiet healing. The kids still had their moments. But they were trying, and that was enough. Miss Layla stayed. And because she stayed, they started to believe they were worth staying for. The days that followed were like watching winter slowly give way to spring. The classroom that once echoed with mocking laughter and cruel jokes now carried a different kind of sound. Tentative questions, quiet apologies, and the shuffle of pages being turned with actual interest. Still, not everyone changed at once. Some students, like Darius, resisted the shift. He was quieter than Jamal, not the type to throw things or yell across the room, but his silence was sharp, full of anger that simmered just beneath the surface. He sat at the back of the class with his hood pulled low and his arms folded, daring anyone to try and reach him. Miss Layla didn't push. She gave him space, but not distance. Every day she greeted him with the same soft, "Good morning, Darius," even when he didn't answer. She'd leave his worksheet on his desk with a pen neatly placed on top, never pointing out when he didn't touch it. She just kept showing up, gently, consistently, patiently. It was something he wasn't used to. People usually gave up on him fast. The first breakthrough came unexpectedly. The class was reading a short story about a boy who had lost his father and was navigating life with grief wrapped around his chest like iron chains. Miss Layla had asked them to write a letter to the character, giving advice or sharing how they would help him. Most students scribbled generic advice or vague encouragements, but Darius surprised everyone. Without saying a word, he turned in a full page. He had written, "You probably don't want to hear from anyone right now. You're tired of people pretending they understand. I get it. My dad's not dead, but he might as well be. He left when I was 9, and every time I see his car drive past our block without stopping, it's like getting punched in the stomach all over again. But I guess if I could tell you one thing, it's that maybe you're still here for a reason. That maybe the world didn't end, even though it feels like it did. So I guess, just don't give up. That's what I'm trying to do too. Miss Layla read it with tears in her eyes. She didn't read it aloud. She didn't put a gold star on the top or make a big show of it. She just placed a small note on his desk the next day. It said, "Thank you for your honesty. You're stronger than you think. Keep writing." That was the beginning of something quiet but powerful. Darius started participating more. Not always, not loudly, but enough that others noticed. And slowly, the class began to mirror that change. They began to respect each other's words, to sit still when someone else was speaking, to laugh in ways that didn't tear others down. Miss Layla knew the transformation wasn't magic. It was the result of consistency, of seeing the humanity behind the misbehavior, of creating a space where it was safe to feel again. She shared more of her own story, too. She told them about how she had almost dropped out of college because she couldn't afford books. How she worked night shifts at a diner and still made it to class each morning. How, one day, a professor noticed the bruises on her arm and asked if she was okay. It was the first time someone had really asked. That professor helped her get counseling, helped her apply for grants, and reminded her that her life wasn't defined by where she came from, but by what she chose to become. The students listened more closely than she expected. They began to ask questions, not just about English or grammar, but about life. About how to deal with parents who didn't understand, with friends who betrayed them, with anxiety that made it hard to breathe. Miss Layla never had all the answers, but she always made time to listen. She made that classroom more than a place to learn. It became a place to belong, and even the teachers in the break room began to notice. "You've done something with 7B I've never seen," one teacher said. "What's your secret?" Miss Layla only smiled. "I just don't stop showing up," she replied. "Even when it hurts." Her words weren't just for the kids. They were for herself, too, because even Miss Layla had moments at night where she'd sit in her small apartment and wonder if she was really making a difference. But every apology, every story, every shift in the way her students saw each other reminded her healing takes time, but it always starts with someone who refuses to give up. The most powerful moment came 2 months later during a school assembly. The principal invited students to speak about someone who inspired them. No one expected anyone from 7B to participate, but when Jamal stood up and walked to the microphone, the entire auditorium went still. He cleared his throat and said, "I want to talk about Miss Layla. We weren't kind to her when she came. We messed up, I messed up. But she didn't leave. She saw us, really saw us, and kept coming back, even after we gave her every reason not to. She made me believe I could be more than a joke or a mistake. I think a lot of us in 7B feel that way now. So yeah, thank you, Miss Layla," she cried. Not loudly, not in a way that took over the moment, but enough to feel the impact of every word in her soul. That night, she wrote in her journal, "They tore my shirt, but they didn't break me." And maybe, just maybe, that's how you teach a heart to heal, by standing in the brokenness and offering love anyway. The change didn't happen in one day, or even in 1 week, but something real had taken root in the hearts of the students, something fragile yet unmistakably alive. The girl who used to mock everything Miss Layla said now stayed behind after class to ask about extra credit. The boy who once flung insults like arrows now volunteered to help arrange the chairs for group activities. And the tension that used to hang in the room like smoke began to clear, replaced by something that felt almost sacred trust. Still, not every day was perfect. There were setbacks, moments when old habits resurfaced. One day, during a heated discussion, Marcus shouted across the room at a classmate, calling him something cruel and cutting. The room fell silent, the way it always used to before Miss Layla would step in. But this time, she didn't yell or send anyone to the hallway. She simply stood there, calm, and said, "We've all been hurt, but we don't have to become the hurt we've received." Her voice wasn't loud, but it was powerful enough to pierce through the tension. She looked at Marcus, not with condemnation, but with a firm kind of grace. "You can try again," she said. "And if you're willing to repair what was broken, we can move forward together." Marcus hesitated, his jaw tight, but then something softened. He mumbled an apology to his classmate and sat down. It was awkward and imperfect, but it was real. That moment became a lesson far more valuable than anything written in their textbooks. The students began to learn that strength wasn't found in dominance or sarcasm. It was found in humility, in the courage to say, "I was wrong," and in the power of making things right. Miss Layla never needed to raise her voice. She didn't rely on fear to control the room. Instead, she built a foundation of respect by offering it first. And it was this quiet power that began to reshape the hearts in room 7B. She introduced something new each Friday, what she called real talk circles. Desks were pushed into a circle, and each student was invited to speak without judgment. No one was forced. Some students stayed quiet for weeks, but eventually everyone shared something. They talked about things no curriculum ever covered. What it felt like to grow up without a father, the pain of watching a sibling fall into addiction, the fear of never being good enough, the silent pressure to act tough when everything inside was falling apart. In one of those circles, Zoe revealed through tears that her older sister had been arrested and that she didn't know how to talk about it with anyone. Her voice cracked when she said, "People think I'm loud because I'm confident, but really I just don't want anyone to know I'm scared all the time." The class listened in silence, not the kind of silence that judges, but the kind that holds space. And when she finished, Jamal, once the loudest, most defiant boy in the room, said quietly, "I feel that. I pretend to laugh all the time so people won't notice I'm depressed." No one laughed. No one mocked. In that moment, they all became more human to one another, and that humanity began to shape the way they interacted. Even when things got tense, even when frustrations bubbled up, there was now an undercurrent of care that hadn't been there before. They had seen each other's wounds, and it made them less likely to inflict more. Miss Layla never claimed to have all the answers. She simply showed them that they mattered, that their stories mattered, and that they didn't have to let pain define who they were becoming. She encouraged them to write those stories, not just for grades, but for growth. Some students began journaling regularly. Others asked if they could turn their essays into spoken-word pieces. By the time spring arrived, the classroom was full of poems taped to the walls, handwritten notes of encouragement on desks, and drawings that illustrated their inner struggles. Even the principal noticed. During an evaluation visit, he stood at the back of the room, watching as students respectfully debated themes in a novel they were reading. Afterward, he said quietly, "I don't know what you did, but this feels like a different school." Miss Layla smiled and replied, "I just gave them a reason to believe they were more than what others said they were." The real turning point came when the class received an assignment to write a letter to their younger self. It was a hard one. At first, they resisted, saying it was dumb, pointless. But once they started, they couldn't stop. Some wrote with rage, others with sorrow. Many wept as they confessed the things they never got to say, the apologies they never received, the fears they never voiced, the dreams they were too afraid to chase. Darius, who once sat silent in the back of the room, wrote a letter that simply said, "You're not the problem. It's not your fault he left. And even though you feel like you're not worth loving, one day, someone's going to believe in you until you believe it too." That letter, like so many others, was placed in a special binder Miss Layla kept at the front of the class, a silent monument to their growth. Near the end of the year, when the school hosted a parents' night, room 7B was full of light. Projects lined the walls. Students stood by their work with pride in their eyes. One parent, wiping tears from her face, said, "I don't know what you did to my son, but I haven't seen him this hopeful in years." Miss Layla smiled, her heart swelling with quiet joy. Because this wasn't just a class anymore. It was a community, a sanctuary, a place where broken pieces were not discarded, but lovingly gathered and given the space to become whole again. And all of it began with a torn shirt, a choice not to retaliate, and a belief that even the hardest hearts can be softened with consistent love. As the school year stretched into its final months, the transformation in room 7B continued to unfold like a story only grace could write. The classroom once known for chaos had become a sanctuary not because the students had suddenly become perfect, but because they had been given something far more powerful than discipline. They had been given dignity. Every week, Miss Layla continued her real talk circles, and every week another layer was peeled back. The stories grew deeper, more vulnerable, and more real. They began to understand that behind every act of rebellion was a cry for attention. Behind every smirk was often a secret wound. And they began to carry each other's burdens in small but profound ways. One rainy Thursday, a boy named Andre, who had struggled with reading all year, finally raised his hand to read aloud. His voice shook, his eyes darted across the page, but he pushed through each word with fierce determination. No one laughed, no one sighed or rolled their eyes. Instead, they encouraged him. When he finished, the room burst into applause, not the kind of applause given for performance, but the kind born from shared pride. Andre smiled for the first time all year, and Miss Layla had to look away for a moment just to keep from crying. It was in these moments, often quiet and uncelebrated by the outside world, that she saw the true power of transformation. The students began leaving her little notes. Some were folded scraps of paper with doodles and thank yous. Others were more personal. One note from Zoe read, "I never thought a teacher would care about me as a person. You don't just teach us how to read stories, you help us write our own." Another from Jamal said, "Thanks for not giving up on me. I used to think being mean was the only way to survive. You showed me different." Miss Layla kept these notes in a wooden box on her desk, a quiet reminder that her efforts were not in vain, but not everything was smooth. Around mid-May, a fight broke out between two students in the hallway, one of them from her class. The administration cracked down, suspensions were issued, and whispers began again about 7B slipping back to its old ways. Miss Layla was called into a meeting with the principal, who expressed concern. She listened carefully, but when it was her turn to speak she said, "Change isn't linear. Setbacks don't erase growth. These students are learning how to unlearn pain, and that takes time, patience, and more than just consequences." The principal looked at her for a long moment before finally nodding. "You believe in them," he said, "even when no one else does." "Especially when no one else does," she replied. She returned to class that day with a heavy heart, but refused to let discouragement take the lead. Instead of scolding her students, she addressed them with honesty. "You're not here to be perfect," she said. "You're here to grow, and growing means messing up sometimes. What matters is what you do next." That conversation opened another wave of healing. The student who had fought came to her after school and said, "I don't know why I lose it sometimes. It's like I can't stop it." She sat with him in the empty classroom and said, "Because no one ever taught you how. But that's what we're doing now. We're learning how to stop the cycle." He nodded slowly, and for the first time, his tough exterior cracked, and tears fell down his cheeks. She handed him a tissue and didn't say a word until he was ready to speak again. Moments like these didn't make headlines. They didn't come with awards or recognition. But they were the reason Miss Layla woke up every morning and came to school with renewed purpose. Near the end of the semester, the students began preparing for a final project, a presentation of personal growth. They could write, perform, draw, or film. However they wanted to express what they had learned, not just academically, but emotionally and personally. The room buzzed with creative energy. Darius, who once refused to speak in front of anyone, prepared a spoken-word piece about his father. Zoe choreographed a dance that told the story of her anxiety and how she found strength in vulnerability. Jamal wrote a monologue called "The Mask I Wore," and when he performed it in front of the class, no one could look away. "I wore a mask that looked like laughter, like power, like I didn't care," he said. "But underneath, I was just a scared kid who didn't want to be hurt again." And then Miss Layla walked in and saw past the mask. She didn't call me out, she called me in. And because of that, I finally saw myself. When he finished, the room was silent. Then, one by one, students stood and applauded. It wasn't about grades anymore. It was about truth, healing, and reclaiming their voices. On the last day of school, Miss Layla walked into a room decorated with "Thank You" banners, handmade cards, and even a small cake that read, to the one who stayed. The students gathered around her, laughing and talking over each other, not because they were being disruptive, but because they were full of joy. They had become a family. She stood there, overwhelmed, humbled, and grateful. Jamal handed her a small wrapped box. Inside was a delicate silver necklace with a charm in the shape of a quill. "Because you helped us write our real story," he said. Her eyes filled with tears as she looked at all of them, their faces no longer guarded or bitter, but alive with hope. "Thank you," she whispered, "for letting me be part of your story." And they all knew, deep in their hearts, that room 7B had become more than a classroom. It had become a place of redemption. A reminder that even when things break, they can still be rebuilt with love. The summer air drifted lazily through the open windows of room 7B, mixing with the soft rustle of papers and the quiet hum of students cleaning out their desks. It was the last day of school. The once chaotic room was now filled with gentle laughter, playful teasing, and a kind of peace that had once seemed impossible. Miss Layla moved slowly between the desks, collecting final projects, helping tape loose posters, and offering warm smiles to students who just months ago wouldn't even look her in the eye. Each corner of the room held memories, some hard, some healing, all of them real. She paused at the front of the class, looking out at the students who had grown in ways most would never see. They had walked through fire together, not the kind that burns buildings but the kind that refines hearts. They had cried, apologized, forgiven, and learned to love themselves enough to change. And now, the time had come to say goodbye. Miss Layla didn't prepare a speech. She didn't need one. Her eyes, warm and bright, did most of the speaking for her. "I don't have big words for today," she said softly. "Just this. I'm proud of you. Not because you became perfect, but because you chose not to stay where you were. You allowed yourselves to grow. You allowed yourselves to be seen. And that's brave." The class sat in silence, not out of boredom, but because her words touched the very center of them. Jamal, sitting near the back where he used to launch paper balls and sarcasm, now leaned forward, completely present. Zoe clutched a letter she had written to Miss Layla, but hadn't yet found the courage to give. Darius tapped his pencil nervously, waiting for the right moment to say what had been living in his heart since the beginning of the semester. Then, slowly, one student stood up. It was Andra, the quiet boy who once struggled just to pronounce simple words in front of others. "Miss Layla," he said, his voice slightly trembling, "you didn't just teach us about books. You taught us how to be people. You saw stuff in us we didn't even know was there. And you made it okay to be messed up, so thank you." One by one, the others joined in. Some shared stories, others simple thank yous, and a few just gave her long hugs that spoke louder than words. Even the toughest students, the ones with the coldest eyes when she first arrived, now held softness in their gaze. One of the boys, Malik, who had barely spoken all year, finally whispered to her as he hugged her, "I'm going to be something now. You made me believe that." She held his hand for a moment and said, "You already are something, Malik. Don't ever forget that." The bell rang one final time that year, a sound that once marked escape now marked the end of something sacred. The students filed out slowly, many lingering at the door, reluctant to leave. Some wiped tears they tried to hide, others promised to write, to visit, to never forget. As the room emptied, Miss Layla sat down at her desk. Alone now, she looked around and felt the full weight of what had happened that year. They tore her shirt on the first day. They had humiliated her, mocked her, tested every part of her patience and spirit. But they had also transformed. And in that transformation, they had taught her too. She learned that love isn't loud. It's patient. It shows up, again and again, especially when it's inconvenient, uncomfortable, or unnoticed. She learned that the ones who push you away the hardest are often the ones who need connection the most. And she learned that sometimes, the greatest victories don't come with trophies or applause. They come in whispered thank yous, healed hearts, and restored hope. Her phone buzzed with a message from the principal. It read, "You've been offered a full-time position again next year. Any classroom you choose." She smiled quietly. She typed back, "7B, please. If they need me again." She looked down at the wooden box of notes her students had written throughout the year. She opened one at random. It was from Zoe. You taught me how to be more than the pain that happened to me. You reminded me I could still be soft and still be strong. Thank you for choosing us. She folded the note and placed it back in the box with a deep breath. As the sun set outside the classroom window, golden light spilled across the empty desks, and in that light, Room 7B glowed with the silent evidence of something rare and unforgettable. A story of redemption. A story of patience. A story of choosing love when it would have been easier to walk away. Miss Layla gathered her things slowly, not with exhaustion but with fulfillment. Because she knew now what was possible when one person chooses not to give up. And somewhere in the distance, in homes across the neighborhood, kids who were once labeled hopeless now sat with their journals, their letters, and their quiet belief that they mattered. They were not the same, and neither was she. The broken pieces had become a mosaic, imperfect, beautiful, and real. And it had all started with one torn shirt and the decision to love anyway. The summer passed quietly, and though the hallways of the school were empty, Room 7B held onto the spirit that had been born there. The walls, still decorated with the students' poems, drawings, and quotes scribbled in colorful marker, were like echoes of voices that once felt unheard. Miss Layla returned a few days before the new school year to prepare the room. She stood in the center of the classroom, looking around, her fingers gently brushing the corner of a desk where Jamal once carved his initials. There was something sacred about this space now. It had been a place of deep breaking, but also of deep mending. She knew she'd never be the same because of what happened here. She unpacked new supplies and arranged the desks in a familiar circle. The same circle they had used for their real talk sessions. She wanted to keep the heart of the classroom the same, even if the faces were new. She didn't know what this next group would be like, but she knew this. She would be ready for whatever brokenness walked through that door, because she had learned that behind every act of cruelty, there was almost always a story of pain, and that those who lash out the loudest are often those who feel the most invisible. As she placed a small photo on her desk, a candid picture of her and the old 7 and B students from the last day of school, she found herself whispering a prayer, not for ease, but for strength, not for peace, but for purpose, and most of all, not for perfection, but for the courage to love fiercely again, even if it hurt. Then, as if on cue, her phone buzzed. A message from Jamal. It read, "Miss Layla, I just wanted you to know I'm doing good. I'm mentoring kids at the community center now. You made me want to be that kind of person. Thank you. I hope your new class knows how lucky they are." She blinked back tears. She hadn't expected to hear from him, and yet here he was, a reminder that the seeds she planted had grown, even outside the walls of the classroom. A few minutes later, another message popped up. This one was from Zoe. "Hey Miss Layla, college is hard but I'm trying. I still write when I feel overwhelmed. I kept all my letters from class. They still help. Just wanted to say thank you again for not giving up on us. I miss our circles." She smiled and placed the phone down, holding it to her chest for a moment. These messages were more than updates, they were proof. Proof that love sown in pain could still bear fruit. Proof that grace changes lives, even when it doesn't always look like it right away. She thought back to that first day, when her shirt was torn and her heart was nearly crushed by the weight of humiliation. That day she could have walked out and never returned. That day she could have reported the class, demanded transfers, or requested a different assignment. But instead, she chose to stay. She chose to respond with quiet strength and steady love. And now, because of that decision, the ripple effect of healing was still moving through the lives of students who had once been considered beyond reach. She walked over to her desk and pulled out the wooden box. Slowly, carefully, she opened it. The letters were still there, just as she had left them, some written in messy ink, others typed and folded with precision. But each one was a testimony. She picked up Darius's letter, the one where he wrote to his younger self. "You're not the problem," it said. "It's not your fault. You are still worthy of love." She read it again, even though she had memorized every word. She read it to remind herself, because even the strongest teachers have days where they question whether what they do matters. Then she looked out the window where a few early, arriving students were playing by the courtyard. A new group of hearts. A new set of stories. Some of them would arrive with shields already up. Some would be quiet. Others would be loud. A few would be defiant, trying to see how far they could push before someone pushed back. But Miss Layla wouldn't push back with punishment. She would push back with compassion. She would show up, day after day, until the walls cracked and the truth poured out. She would offer dignity where there had been shame. She would offer hope where there had been cynicism. She would offer love, not the soft, easy kind, but the relentless, brave kind. And maybe, just maybe, some of them would leave this room believing in themselves the way Jamal, Zoe, and Darius now did. Maybe this new 7B would find healing too. And so, as the first bell of the new year rang, Miss Layla stood at the front of the classroom once more. Her hands no longer trembled. Her voice, still gentle, was now unshakably grounded. She welcomed each student by name as they entered, looking them in the eye, seeing past the mask each one wore. And though none of them knew the journey that had taken place in that very room just months before, the spirit of it remained. The courage, the growth, the love. Room 7B was ready again, not because it had been cleaned or repainted, but because its heart, Miss Layla, was still there, steady as ever, ready to begin again.